My uncle said I was a disgrace to the family until I found his missing daughter alive. Uncle Lawrence told me I'd ruined the family name at Thanksgiving dinner in front of 37 relatives, his voice loud enough that conversation stopped at every table in my grandmother's house. He'd been drinking since noon, bourbon straight with ice that clinked against crystal when he gestured at me with his glass. He said my father would be ashamed of how I'd turned out, that dropping out of law school to become a private investigator was an insult to 3 generations of attorneys who'd built our reputation. He said I was chasing conspiracy theories and divorce cases instead of doing real work that mattered. My Aunt Philippa had touched his arm, trying to quiet him, but he'd shrugged her off and continued. He'd said the Harrington name meant something in this city, that judges and politicians and business leaders respected us, and I was dragging that legacy through the mud by working for criminals and cheaters. I'd left before dessert, driving back to my studio apartment above a pawn shop on the east side where the Harrington name meant absolutely nothing. My phone had buzzed with texts from cousins saying Uncle Lawrence was drunk and didn't mean it, but I'd heard the same speech sober at my father's funeral 2 years ago. Lawrence had made it clear then that I was a disappointment, that quitting Columbia Law after 1 semester proved I didn't have the discipline or intelligence to continue the family tradition. Never mind that I'd quit because the student loans were drowning me, and my father's gambling debts had consumed every dollar of the inheritance I'd expected. Never mind that private investigation let me use the research skills I'd actually enjoyed from law school without the crushing debt. Lawrence saw only failure and embarrassment. The call came at 2:13 in the morning 3 days after Thanksgiving. I'd been asleep for maybe an hour, having spent most of the night reviewing surveillance footage for a workman's comp fraud case. The phone screen showed Aunt Philippa's number, and I'd answered expecting some family emergency with my grandmother. Instead, Philippa had been crying so hard I could barely understand her words. She'd said Vanessa was missing, that her 17-year-old daughter hadn't come home from school, that her phone was going straight to voicemail. She'd said the police were involved, but treating it like a runaway situation, telling them to wait 24 hours before filing a report. She'd begged me to help find her niece because she knew I had connections the police didn't, resources that could start searching immediately. I'd asked if Lawrence knew she was calling me, and there'd been a long pause before Philippa had said no, that he'd forbidden her from contacting me about anything. She'd said he was so angry about Vanessa disappearing that he wasn't thinking clearly, that he'd spent hours screaming at the police about their incompetence instead of actually helping search. She'd said she didn't care what Lawrence thought anymore, that finding Vanessa mattered more than family politics. I'd told her to send me everything she had, every photo, every detail about Vanessa's last known location, every name of friends and teachers and anyone Vanessa had mentioned recently. I'd said I'd start immediately, even though Lawrence would probably sue me for interfering. The files came through within minutes. Vanessa Harrington, 17 years old, honor student at Riverside Preparatory Academy, captain of the debate team, early acceptance to Princeton already secured. Last seen leaving school at 3:15 on Monday afternoon, captured on security camera getting into a silver sedan that didn't belong to anyone in the family. Her phone had pinged near the interstate around 4:30, then went completely dark. No activity on social media since Monday morning. No credit card purchases, no contact with any of her known friends, just vanished, like she'd been erased from existence. I pulled up the security footage Philippa had somehow obtained from the school. The timestamp showed Vanessa walking across the parking lot with her backpack, looking down at her phone. A silver Toyota Camry had pulled up beside her, and she'd gotten in voluntarily. No signs of struggle or hesitation. I couldn't see the driver clearly through the tinted windows, but Vanessa had smiled when the door opened like she recognized whoever was inside. That detail mattered. She hadn't been grabbed off the street by a stranger. She'd gone willingly with someone she knew or at least felt comfortable with. I started with Vanessa's social media, scrolling back through months of posts. The public-facing version showed a perfect student with perfect grades and perfect friends, all carefully curated photos at debate tournaments and charity events. But social media lies, especially for teenagers from wealthy families who understand that everything they post becomes evidence of their character. I needed to see what Vanessa was really thinking, who she was really talking to, what she was hiding from her parents. I called in a favor from a hacker named Desmond, who owed me for not turning him in on a previous case. He could access deleted messages and private accounts that most people assumed were completely erased. Desmond called back 40 minutes later with information that shifted the entire case. Vanessa had a secret Instagram account under the name vriverdale23, private and hidden from family searches. She'd been messaging extensively with someone named Drew Thompson Official for the past 3 months. The conversations started friendly, him complimenting her debate performances that he'd apparently watched online. Then they'd gotten more personal, him asking about her family and her future plans, and whether she felt trapped by expectations. Vanessa had opened up in ways that suggested Drew understood. Her in ways her family didn't, talking about pressure to be perfect and fear of disappointing people. The messages from the past week showed Drew suggesting they meet in person, that he had something important to tell her about her father. Vanessa had been hesitant at first, saying her parents would never allow her to meet someone they hadn't vetted. Drew had said this was about her father specifically, information Lawrence was hiding that would change how Vanessa saw her family. He'd said she deserved to know the truth before she went to Princeton and became part of the same system that protected people like Lawrence. Vanessa had agreed to meet him on Monday after school. The last message from her, sent at 3:12, said she was walking to the parking lot and saw his car. I ran the name Drew Thompson through every database I had access to. Nothing. The Instagram account was barely 2 months old with generic stock photos and no real personal information. The email attached to the account was a burner created through a VPN that masked the actual location. This wasn't some random teenager Vanessa had met online. This was someone deliberately building a false identity to gain her trust. Someone who'd researched her family enough to know what vulnerabilities to exploit. Someone who'd specifically mentioned Lawrence by name, using him as bait to get Vanessa alone. I called Philippa at 4 in the morning and told her about Drew Thompson. She'd said that name meant nothing to her, that she'd never heard Vanessa mention anyone named Drew. I'd asked if Lawrence had any enemies, anyone with a grudge who might target his daughter. Philippa had laughed bitterly and said Lawrence had built his entire legal career on destroying people in court, that he represented corporations against workers and landlords against tenants and insurance companies against injury victims. She'd said half the city probably had reasons to hate him, but she couldn't imagine who would go after Vanessa instead of Lawrence directly. I'd said that was exactly the point. Going after Lawrence directly would trigger immediate police response and legal protection. But taking his daughter created maximum pain with less immediate risk. Whoever Drew Thompson really was, he'd understood that the fastest way to destroy Lawrence Harrington was through his family. Philippa had asked what we should do, and I'd said we needed to tell the police immediately that this was a kidnapping, not a runaway situation. She'd agreed, but said Lawrence would have to make the call because the police wouldn't take her seriously without him backing up the story. The conversation with Lawrence happened at 6 in the morning in his study that overlooked the city from the penthouse floor of his office building. I'd driven there knowing he'd try to throw me out, but Philippa had called ahead and told him I had information about Vanessa. He'd been sitting behind his mahogany desk, still wearing yesterday's clothes, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The famous Lawrence Harrington, who commanded courtrooms and terrified opposing counsel, looked exhausted and frightened. He gestured for me to sit without saying anything about Thanksgiving dinner or my career choices or the family name. I'd laid out everything I'd found: the secret Instagram account, the messages with Drew Thompson, the planned meeting, the silver Camry captured on school security footage. Lawrence had listened without interrupting, his hands pressed flat against the desk. When I'd finished, he'd asked why someone would target Vanessa to get to him. I'd said he knew his own enemies better than I did, that he needed to think about cases where he'd won by destroying someone's life. He'd said that described most of his career, that corporate law meant crushing individuals who challenged powerful institutions. I'd asked him to narrow it down to cases from the past year, people who'd specifically threatened him or his family. Lawrence had pulled up his case files and started scrolling, muttering names and dates. He'd stopped on a case from 8 months ago, a wrongful termination lawsuit where he'd represented a pharmaceutical company against a whistleblower named Gerald Thompson. The name Thompson made my hands go cold. Lawrence had said Gerald Thompson had accused the company of falsifying drug trial data, that Lawrence had destroyed his credibility by revealing Thompson's history of depression and medication. Thompson had lost everything: his job, his reputation, his marriage. He'd sent Lawrence threatening letters that security had dismissed as empty rage from a defeated opponent. I'd asked if Gerald Thompson had a son named Drew, and Lawrence had said yes, that Drew Thompson had been in the courtroom during the trial, watching his father get humiliated. Lawrence remembered because Drew had shouted at him during the verdict. Something about Lawrence destroying good people to protect corporate criminals. Security had removed Drew from the building, and Lawrence had filed for a restraining order that Drew had violated twice. But eventually Drew had stopped making contact, and Lawrence had assumed he'd moved on. That had been 6 months ago. Now Drew had Vanessa, and we had no idea where. The police took the case seriously once Lawrence called with evidence of premeditated kidnapping. Detective Ariana Foster arrived at Lawrence's office within an hour with a team of investigators. She'd reviewed the Instagram messages and security footage, then immediately put out alerts for the silver Toyota Camry. She'd said they were running Gerald Thompson's known addresses and checking surveillance footage near the interstate where Vanessa's phone had last pinged. She'd warned that if Drew Thompson wanted revenge against Lawrence, he might not be interested in negotiation or ransom. This could be about making Lawrence suffer by hurting Vanessa in ways that couldn't be undone. Lawrence had demanded Foster deploy every available resource, threatening to call the mayor and police commissioner if this didn't become top priority. Foster had said they were already treating this as a critical case, but needed Lawrence to provide information about Gerald Thompson and their history. Lawrence had turned to me and said I should handle that briefing since I'd done the initial investigation. I'd looked at him confused, because this was his moment to take control, to use his connections and authority to save his daughter. Instead, he'd admitted he was too emotionally compromised to think clearly, that he needed me to work with police because I'd already proven I could find information he'd missed. The acknowledgement had felt hollow after years of contempt, but I'd agreed because finding Vanessa mattered more than family grudges. I'd spent the next 3 hours with Detective Foster going through Gerald Thompson's entire history. His employment records showed a brilliant chemist who'd worked at Meridian Pharmaceuticals for 15 years before discovering data manipulation in a drug trial. He'd reported it to his supervisors who'd buried his concerns and started a campaign to discredit him. When Thompson had gone public, Meridian had hired Lawrence to destroy his credibility in court. Lawrence had done his job perfectly, painting Thompson as an unstable conspiracy theorist whose allegations were motivated by mental illness rather than evidence. The jury had ruled against Thompson and awarded Meridian damages for reputational harm. Thompson had lost his license to practice chemistry and been blacklisted from the pharmaceutical industry. His wife had filed for divorce, claiming his obsession with the case had destroyed their marriage. Drew Thompson, 19 at the time, had watched his father's complete destruction play out in public. According to court transcripts, Drew had given emotional testimony about how his father's whistleblowing had been morally right, even if legally unsuccessful. Lawrence had used that testimony to paint Gerald Thompson as a man who'd prioritized ideology over family responsibility. Foster had tracked Gerald Thompson to an apartment in the industrial district where he'd been living alone since his divorce. Officers found him passed out drunk, surrounded by newspaper clippings about Lawrence Harrington and Meridian Pharmaceuticals. Thompson had been incoherent when questioned, initially claiming Drew was visiting family out of state. But when Foster had shown him the Instagram messages between Drew and Vanessa, something had broken in Gerald Thompson's face. He'd started crying and saying this wasn't supposed to happen, that Drew had promised he was done seeking revenge, that they'd agreed to rebuild their lives without Lawrence Harrington in them. Foster had asked where Drew would take Vanessa, and Gerald Thompson had said he didn't know, that Drew had his own apartment somewhere in the city, but had stopped giving his father the address months ago. Thompson had said Drew blamed Lawrence for destroying their family, that he'd become obsessed with making Lawrence feel the same loss and helplessness Thompson had experienced. Foster had asked if Drew was violent, and Thompson had said not physically, that Drew wanted Lawrence to suffer emotionally and psychologically, the way Thompson had suffered when his reputation and career were destroyed in court. The search for Drew Thompson's address consumed the next 6 hours. Foster had teams checking rental records and utility bills and employment databases. I'd focused on the Instagram messages, looking for any clues about where Drew might have taken Vanessa. One message mentioned a place where they could talk privately without anyone finding them, somewhere that represented everything wrong with Lawrence's work. Vanessa had asked what he meant, and Drew had said she'd understand when she saw it. That cryptic reference felt important, but I couldn't decode it without more information about Drew's thinking. I'd called Desmond again and asked him to pull Drew Thompson's digital footprint from the past year. Everything he'd searched, everywhere his phone had pinged, any online activity that might reveal his location. Desmond had said that would take time, but he'd prioritize it. Meanwhile, Foster had discovered that Drew Thompson had been working cash jobs under false names since his father's trial, deliberately staying off official records. He'd been saving money and planning something for months. The premeditation suggested this wasn't an impulsive kidnapping, but a carefully orchestrated revenge plot with specific goals. Lawrence had been pacing his office making calls to contacts in law enforcement and private security. He'd offered a $50,000 reward for information leading to Vanessa's safe return. He'd hired a private security firm to conduct parallel investigation efforts. He'd called in favors from judges and prosecutors he'd worked with over his career. Watching him operate reminded me why he'd been so successful in his field. He knew how to mobilize resources and pressure systems. But for the first time, I'd seen him admit that power had limitations, that money and connections couldn't guarantee his daughter's safety against someone motivated by revenge rather than profit. Desmond called back at 7 in the evening with a breakthrough. He'd traced Drew Thompson's most frequent location pings to an abandoned warehouse in the riverfront industrial zone. The warehouse had belonged to Meridian Pharmaceuticals until 5 years ago, when they'd shut down that facility and moved production overseas. The building had been sitting empty since then, scheduled for demolition but delayed by environmental cleanup requirements. Drew had been accessing that location regularly for the past 2 months, his phone pinging from there at odd hours. Desmond said if Drew wanted symbolic revenge against Lawrence by using a location connected to Gerald Thompson's downfall, that warehouse would be perfect. I'd called Foster immediately with the address, and she'd said they were mobilizing tactical units for a rescue operation. She'd told me to stay out of it, that this was now a police matter requiring professional negotiators and SWAT teams. Lawrence had been standing next to me and heard Foster's instructions. He'd said we should let the police handle this, that I'd done enough by finding the location. But something in his voice suggested he didn't fully trust that outcome, that he was terrified police procedure and negotiation protocols would give Drew time to hurt Vanessa in ways that couldn't be fixed. I'd made a decision that would either save Vanessa or end my investigation career permanently. I told Lawrence I was going to the warehouse ahead of police to assess the situation. He'd said that was insane and illegal and would compromise the official response. I'd said the police would take at least an hour to organize their operation while Drew might hurt Vanessa immediately if he knew they were coming. I'd said someone needed eyes on the situation now, someone who could determine if Vanessa was in immediate danger. Lawrence had stared at me for a long moment before nodding and saying he was coming with me. The drive to Riverfront took 30 minutes through late evening traffic. Lawrence had called Foster and told her we were going to the warehouse, giving her our timeline so police could coordinate their arrival. Foster had been furious, saying we were endangering Vanessa and ourselves by interfering. Lawrence had said we'd maintain distance and only observe unless Vanessa was in immediate danger. Foster had said if we compromised her operation, she'd have us both arrested for obstruction. Lawrence had agreed to those terms and ended the call. The warehouse loomed against the evening sky, a massive concrete structure with broken windows and graffiti covering the lower walls. The parking lot was empty, except for a silver Toyota Camry parked near a side entrance. I'd pulled over a block away and turned off my headlights. Lawrence and I had approached on foot, staying in shadows between other abandoned buildings. The side door was propped open with a brick, suggesting Drew wanted easy access. I'd pulled out my phone and texted Foster our exact location and the presence of the silver Camry. She'd responded saying tactical units were 15 minutes away and we should not enter the building under any circumstances. I'd looked at Lawrence and seen him staring at that open door with an expression I'd never witnessed before. Fear. Real terror about what might be happening to his daughter inside that building. He'd whispered that he couldn't wait 15 minutes, that every second might matter if Drew was hurting Vanessa. I'd said we needed to be smart about this, that rushing in could escalate the situation. Lawrence had pulled out his phone and opened an audio recording app. He'd said, if we were going in, we needed to document everything for legal protection and evidence. I'd agreed and started my own recording. We'd entered through the side door into a corridor that smelled like mold and decay. Emergency exit signs provided dim green lighting that barely penetrated the darkness. I could hear voices echoing from somewhere deeper in the building, one male and one female. The female voice was crying, begging someone to let her go. Lawrence had grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt, his entire body rigid with rage and fear. I'd pulled up a building schematic on my phone that Desmond had sent earlier, showing the warehouse layout. The voices were coming from the old production floor in the center of the structure. We'd moved slowly through the corridor, trying to stay silent despite debris crunching under our feet. The voices got clearer as we approached the production floor. I could hear Drew Thompson now, his tone calm and controlled. He was telling Vanessa about his father's case, describing in detail how Lawrence had used Gerald Thompson's medical history against him in court. He was explaining how Lawrence had deliberately portrayed his father as mentally unstable rather than addressing the actual evidence of pharmaceutical fraud. Drew said Lawrence had destroyed a good man's life to protect corporate criminals who'd falsified drug trials that could hurt people. Vanessa had been crying and saying she didn't know any of this, that her father never talked about his cases at home. Drew had said that was the point, that Lawrence compartmentalized his destruction of people's lives so he could sleep at night. He'd said Vanessa needed to understand who her father really was before she followed him into the same corrupt system. He'd said Princeton and law school would turn her into another Lawrence Harrington, someone who protected the powerful by crushing the powerless. He wanted her to reject that path and help him expose what Lawrence had done. Lawrence and I had reached a vantage point where we could see onto the production floor without being visible ourselves. The space was enormous, old machinery creating shadows everywhere. In the center, under a skylight, Vanessa sat in a metal chair with her hands zip-tied behind her back. She wasn't visibly injured, but her face was red from crying, and she kept looking around frantically. Drew Thompson stood in front of her holding a phone, recording video of her while he talked. He looked exactly like the photos from his father's trial, early 20s with dark hair and intense eyes that suggested obsession rather than rational thinking. Drew had been explaining that he was going to release the video of Vanessa denouncing her father's corruption, that it would go viral and destroy Lawrence's reputation more effectively than any lawsuit. He'd said Vanessa's voice condemning Lawrence from inside a Meridian Pharmaceuticals warehouse would be poetic justice, using Lawrence's own daughter to expose his crimes. Vanessa had been shaking her head and saying she wouldn't do it, that she didn't even know if what Drew was saying was true. Drew had said the truth didn't matter as much as perception, that the video would raise questions about Lawrence's ethics that would follow him forever. Lawrence had moved before I could stop him, stepping out onto the production floor and shouting Drew's name. Drew had spun around, surprised, the phone dropping from his hand. Vanessa had screamed for her father and started struggling against the zip ties. I'd had no choice but to follow Lawrence into the open, my phone still recording everything. Drew had recovered quickly from his surprise, pulling something from his jacket that made my blood freeze. A knife, long and sharp, the kind used for industrial purposes. He'd pointed it at Lawrence and told him to stop moving or he'd cut Vanessa's throat. Lawrence had frozen, his hands raised in surrender. He'd said Drew didn't want to hurt Vanessa, that this was about making him suffer, not harming an innocent teenager. Drew had laughed bitterly and said Lawrence had no right to talk about harming innocents, that Lawrence had destroyed his father who was also innocent. He'd said Lawrence's entire career was built on protecting guilty corporations while demolishing good people who tried to expose wrongdoing. He'd said it was time Lawrence experienced loss the way Gerald Thompson had experienced it, watching helplessly while someone you love was destroyed. I'd been calculating distances and angles, trying to figure out if I could reach Drew before he could hurt Vanessa. Too far. At least 30 feet with Drew positioned behind Vanessa's chair where he could easily follow through on his threat. I'd said Drew's name and he'd shifted his attention to me. I'd said I knew about his father's case, that I'd read all the trial transcripts and evidence. I'd said Gerald Thompson had been right about Meridian Pharmaceuticals falsifying data, that the drug in question was later pulled from market after multiple patients suffered serious side effects. I'd said Drew's father had been a whistleblower trying to protect people, and Lawrence had destroyed him for it. Lawrence had turned to look at me shocked, and I'd seen Drew's expression change from rage to confusion. Drew had asked how I knew about the drug being pulled, and I'd said I'd researched it after learning about the Thompson case. I'd said the FDA had quietly removed the drug 2 years after the trial, citing safety concerns that matched exactly what Gerald Thompson had reported. I'd said Meridian Pharmaceuticals had paid millions in settlements to patients who'd been harmed, though those settlements were sealed and never made public. I'd said Drew's father had been right about everything, and Lawrence had helped cover it up. Lawrence had started to argue, but I'd cut him off by saying this wasn't the time for legal debate, that we needed to focus on Vanessa's safety. Drew had lowered the knife slightly and said his father's vindication meant nothing if nobody knew about it, that Meridian and Lawrence had successfully buried the truth. I'd said that's what journalism and investigators were for, that I could help Drew expose what happened without hurting Vanessa. I'd said hurting Lawrence's daughter wouldn't bring justice for Gerald Thompson. It would just make Drew a criminal who'd go to prison while Lawrence remained free. Drew had looked torn, the knife still in his hand but no longer pointed at Vanessa. He'd said he'd spent months planning this, that he'd built the fake identity and gained Vanessa's trust, specifically to make Lawrence suffer. I'd said I understood that impulse, that Lawrence had made my own life difficult in different ways. I'd said I knew what it felt like to be dismissed and degraded by Lawrence Harrington. Drew had asked what I meant, and I'd explained I was Lawrence's nephew, that he'd spent years telling me I was a disgrace to the family. I'd said helping Drew expose the truth about his father's case would be my own revenge against Lawrence's corruption. Lawrence had shouted that I was lying, trying to manipulate Drew. I'd ignored him and told Drew I had evidence about other cases where Lawrence had protected corporate wrongdoing, that the Thompson case wasn't isolated. I'd said if Drew let Vanessa go and came with me peacefully, I'd help him build a legitimate case that would actually hurt Lawrence's reputation and career. I'd said we could expose patterns of corruption that would lead to disbarment and criminal charges. Drew had listened carefully, then asked why he should trust me when I was Lawrence's family. I'd said the fact that Lawrence hated me proved whose side I was on, that family loyalty meant nothing when dealing with someone who valued reputation over morality. I'd said releasing video of a traumatized teenager wouldn't accomplish Drew's goals, but a well-documented investigation into Lawrence's career could destroy him legally and professionally. Drew had looked at Vanessa, who was watching this exchange with wide, terrified eyes. He'd asked her if she believed me, and Vanessa had nodded frantically, saying, "Please just let her go home." The knife had slowly lowered, and Drew had stepped away from Vanessa's chair. He'd said he'd think about my offer but needed guarantees that Lawrence wouldn't use his connections to bury everything. I'd said I couldn't guarantee anything, but could promise I'd work to expose the truth about Gerald Thompson's case regardless of consequences. Drew had been nodding when the production floor suddenly filled with red laser dots from tactical team rifles aimed at him from multiple directions. Detective Foster's voice over a loudspeaker had ordered Drew to drop the weapon and step away from the hostage. Everything happened in seconds. Drew had panicked and grabbed Vanessa, pulling her up from the chair with the knife against her throat. Foster had shouted for him to release her. Lawrence had screamed Vanessa's name. I'd moved without thinking, closing the distance between myself and Drew, while he was distracted by the police presence. I'd grabbed his knife arm and twisted hard, using techniques I'd learned during my brief consideration of law enforcement careers. The knife had clattered to the concrete floor, and Drew had shoved Vanessa away from him while trying to break my grip. Tactical officers had swarmed the production floor immediately, separating Drew from Vanessa and securing him in restraints. Foster had reached Vanessa first, cutting the zip ties and checking her for injuries. Vanessa had collapsed into her father's arms, sobbing while Lawrence held her tight and repeated that she was safe. Officers had pulled me away from Drew and checked my hands for injuries from the knife struggle. I'd had a shallow cut across my palm where the blade had caught me, but nothing serious. The adrenaline had been so intense I hadn't felt pain until I saw the blood. Foster had been furious, getting in my face about compromising her operation and nearly getting everyone killed. She'd said I was lucky the outcome had been successful, or she'd have charged me with criminal interference. Lawrence had interrupted and said I'd saved Vanessa's life by keeping Drew calm until police arrived, that my negotiation had prevented Drew from hurting Vanessa when tactical teams moved in. Foster had said that was generous interpretation of reckless behavior, but she'd take my statement and decide later whether charges were appropriate. The ambulance had taken Vanessa and Lawrence to the hospital for evaluation, despite Vanessa insisting she was physically fine. I'd watched them drive away before giving my statement to Foster. I'd told her everything that had happened inside the warehouse, including my admission to Drew about helping expose Lawrence's corrupt cases. Foster had said that conversation would need to be examined carefully, that I might have made promises I couldn't legally keep. I'd said I'd meant every word and would follow through regardless of legal complications. Drew Thompson had been charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and assault with a deadly weapon. Gerald Thompson had been charged as an accessory for not reporting his son's plans to police. The case made headlines because Lawrence Harrington's involvement meant media scrutiny of both the kidnapping and the underlying pharmaceutical fraud case. Reporters had dug into the Meridian trial and found the same evidence I'd mentioned about the drug being pulled from market. Questions had emerged about why Lawrence hadn't faced professional consequences for defending a company that had falsified drug trials. The State Bar Association had opened an investigation into Lawrence's conduct in the Thompson case. Several of his other corporate defense cases came under review as patterns of protecting obvious wrongdoing became public. Lawrence's reputation took damage that no amount of connections or influence could repair. Some clients dropped him while others stood by him, but the shine of being a prestigious attorney had tarnished permanently. Lawrence had to hire his own defense lawyers to fight potential disbarment proceedings. I'd visited Vanessa in the hospital the day after her rescue. She'd been sitting up in bed looking exhausted but unharmed. Lawrence and Philippa had been there, and Lawrence had stepped into the hallway when I arrived, leaving the three of us alone. Vanessa had thanked me for saving her life and apologized for being naive enough to trust Drew Thompson's messages. I'd said she'd been targeted by someone who'd planned carefully to exploit her vulnerabilities, that the manipulation wasn't her fault. Philippa had hugged me and said the family owed me an apology for years of treating me poorly. Lawrence had returned to the room and asked to speak with me privately. We'd walked to a waiting area where he'd stood with his hands in his pockets looking uncomfortable. He'd said he owed me more than thanks for finding Vanessa, that he owed me acknowledgement that I'd been right about my career path. He'd said my investigative skills had accomplished what his legal expertise and connections couldn't, that I'd used research and analysis in ways that mattered more than courtroom arguments. He'd said he'd been wrong to call me a disgrace to the family. I'd said I didn't need his approval anymore, that I'd built a career helping people find truth even when systems and institutions tried to hide it. I'd said the difference between us was that I used investigation to expose corruption, while he used the law to protect it. Lawrence had flinched but nodded and said that was fair criticism. He'd asked if I meant what I'd said to Drew about exposing his corrupt cases. I'd said yes, that I'd already started gathering evidence about cases where Lawrence had defended obvious corporate wrongdoing. He'd said doing that would destroy what remained of his career, and I'd said that was the point. Lawrence had asked if there was any way to make this right without destroying him completely. I'd said there was one option. He could cooperate with bar investigations, admit wrongdoing in cases where he'd knowingly protected fraud, and work to reform corporate defense practices. He'd said that would be professional suicide, and I'd said the alternative was me releasing everything I found to journalists and prosecutors, which would be worse. He'd said he'd think about it, and I'd said he had 1 week to decide before I started making my evidence public. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran my story about Lawrence Harrington's career defending corporate fraud 6 days later, after Lawrence had refused to cooperate with my proposal. The article detailed 5 cases where Lawrence had represented companies accused of serious wrongdoing, including the Thompson pharmaceutical case. Each case showed a pattern of Lawrence using legal technicalities and aggressive tactics to destroy whistleblowers, rather than addressing the underlying evidence. The State Bar Association expanded its investigation and eventually suspended Lawrence's license, pending a full ethics review. Gerald Thompson contacted me through his lawyer asking for help appealing his original case. I'd agreed to assist, and over the following months, we'd built a comprehensive presentation of evidence showing Meridian Pharmaceuticals had indeed falsified drug trial data. The FDA had been forced to reopen its investigation and ultimately fined Meridian millions while requiring additional safety studies. Gerald Thompson's professional reputation was partially restored, though the damage to his life and marriage remained permanent. Drew Thompson had been sentenced to 8 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 5. During his sentencing hearing, he'd apologized to Vanessa directly and said his actions had been wrong despite his legitimate grievances against her father. Vanessa had submitted a victim impact statement saying she forgave Drew and understood his pain, though she'd live with trauma from the kidnapping forever. The judge had considered both Drew's genuine remorse and the severity of his crimes in determining the sentence. I'd rebuilt my relationship with most of the Harrington family except Lawrence, who'd become increasingly isolated as his legal troubles mounted. Philippa had divorced him after the full extent of his professional misconduct became public. Vanessa had deferred Princeton for a year to recover emotionally and was now considering studying journalism instead of law, saying she wanted to expose corruption rather than defend it. She'd been messaging me regularly, asking about investigation techniques and how to research difficult stories. My investigation business had grown significantly after the publicity from finding Vanessa and exposing Lawrence's career. I'd hired 2 associates and moved into a proper office downtown. Most of my cases now involved corporate wrongdoing and whistleblower protection, using my experience with the Thompson case to help people who'd been destroyed for telling the truth. Lawrence Harrington's name still opened doors in my work, but now, because people knew I'd been willing to investigate my own family when justice required it. 3 years after finding Vanessa, I received a letter from Lawrence. He'd been disbarred permanently and was working as a legal consultant from home. He wrote that watching me build a career on integrity had made him reconsider everything he'd valued, that Vanessa's near death had finally broken through his denial about his own corruption, that he spent his remaining years trying to help reform corporate defense practices by consulting with ethics boards. He said he understood I might never forgive him for years of contempt, but he wanted me to know that I'd been right about what kind of work actually mattered. I filed the letter without responding because some apologies arrived too late to change what was broken. Vanessa published her first major investigation last month, exposing pharmaceutical company fraud in a story that would have made her grandfather proud. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.